Over the course of 11 years, more than $2.1 billion in federal funds had been funneled through 42 entities that never appeared in the national accounting system. Half of them shared the same mailing address. 14 had identical financial employee codes, and almost all of these transactions carried a discrete emergency flag, a flag that allowed them to bypass every federal reporting filter. The pattern had gone undetected by the Justice Department. No congressional oversight agency had flagged it. But it didn't start with a high-profile federal investigation or a government leak. It started from a quiet terminal in a shared workspace in Brooklyn, New York. On the second floor of a modest community advocacy office, Zohran Mamdani sat before a battered laptop and a bank of open-source data dashboards. It was 2:17 a.m. The room was silent except for the distant city noise outside and the soft whir of a portable fan. He was alone. No assistants, no cameras, no aides. The audit script Zohran had written days earlier had just returned something he was never meant to see. Transactions between 4 agencies, HUD, CDC, USDA, and the Department of Education, were mirroring each other. On his screen, 4 separate nonprofits appeared to have received identical payments from different departments, all in the same fiscal quarter. Different names, same addresses, same routing codes. The program he'd built was meant to flag overlap. This wasn't overlap. This was deliberate duplication. Zohran leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he manually isolated the records. That's when it appeared, a folder labeled in glaring red text, REDISOLATEAUDIT As soon as he accessed it, the system paused, a deliberate 3-second delay. Then the screen shifted. What appeared wasn't just a data set, it was a structure. 14,027 entries scattered over a decade, each marked with internal tags like election year discretionary or emergency disbursement. None of them had ever been approved by the GAO. The total amount hovered just over $2 billion. He didn't say a word. He didn't even blink. Quietly, Zohran reached for a translucent red USB drive he kept in his desk drawer. With calm precision, he plugged it in. The copying began instantly, silent and quick. 11 seconds later, it was done. About 20 minutes after that, Zohran composed a terse, encrypted memo addressed directly to House Oversight Committee Chair Ayanna Pressley. Sample bypass confirmed, attached, evidence of the red dossier. Urgent oversight hearing recommended under 10 U.S.C. Section 2511. The file was secured. The message was sent. On the other side of the Capitol, Chairwoman Ayanna Pressley received Zohran Mamdani's encrypted document. She weighed its validity. For a long moment, she paced her office, reading and rereading the summary. The night outside was silent, the air cooling as the city slept. Finally, she issued an internal directive to convene a special hearing within 24 hours. An official summons was signed, sealed, and marked as a national investigation. The notice went out before sunrise. In the dim glow of the control room where the document had been transmitted, a message appeared. Federal hearing scheduled. Ayanna Pressley stared at it, unblinking, dissatisfied. She adjusted her sleeves, turned, and walked out. The biometric door hissed shut behind her. The hallway was empty, no voices, no movement. Just the sound of her footsteps echoing across polished floors as she disappeared into the early morning darkness. By dawn, as the first gray light crept over the city, the news had already started to spread. Across media channels and social networks, the night's revelations were about to explode. On Twitter, hashtags like #RedDossier and #TheAuditor began to trend. But inside the Democratic corridors of power, there was no tension. Only a quiet satisfaction. Jamie Raskin, flanked by aides, stopped to pose for a photo just outside the Capitol steps. He didn't wait for questions. Mamdani's audit is finally being audited, he said. Accountability works both ways. 2 hallways away, Letitia James, with a tablet in one hand and a coffee mug in the other, scrolled through Mamdani's old posts. When asked what she expected from the hearing, she didn't even pause. If he wants transparency, she replied, he'll get it, under oath, in 4K, and with a permanent record. Around them, the mood was relaxed, almost complacent. For the party in power, this wasn't a crisis. It was an opportunity, a chance to turn a troublemaking legislator into a footnote. Behind closed doors, senior aides echoed the same line. This would be the end of the Red dossier, not the beginning. By mid-morning, the Capitol grounds were buzzing. Protesters and supporters lined up in two dense rows along First Street, their signs clashing in bold fonts and bitter slogans. Audit Everything faced off against no-tech tyranny, with cable news crews stuck somewhere in the middle. Inside, the mood was more somber. At 9:57 a.m., the auditorium fell silent as staff took their positions. The central monitor remained dark. The nameplate at the witness table was still blank. Then the door opened. Zohran Mamdani entered alone. No team of lawyers, no papers, no hesitation. He wore no party badge, no organization pin, just a dark suit and a red USB drive, which he placed squarely on the table in front of him. He said nothing. He didn't look around. He just sat. The clicking of cameras broke the silence. Chairwoman Ayanna Pressley raised her gavel and spoke, her tone careful and precise. This hearing will now begin. We are called to consider the legal basis, scope, and organizational impact of the material filed as the Red dossier. The witness before us is Representative Zohran Mamdani. Pam Bondi wasted no time. Her voice was calm and deliberate. We're here to follow the money, she said, eyes on the drive, not the headlines. And what we have so far doesn't just follow it, it disappears. It spins and it reappears as something legitimate. Jaime Raskin leaned forward, arms folded. We're not here to chase shadows, he snapped. We're here to protect the balance of power. That balance doesn't shift just because a lawmaker starts decrypting spreadsheets. Zohran didn't flinch. I didn't decrypt spreadsheets, he replied. I was following audit flags that were programmed not to exist. Letitia James sat up straight, sharp as a hammer. Representative Mamdani, she said, did you or did you not access protected government systems without direct authorization from this agency or any legal document? Zohran tilted his head slightly. I didn't break into anything. I opened the government's filing cabinet. The room shifted. Chairwoman Pressley leaned over the USB drive in the center of the table, nodded to the technician at the monitor and spoke. The red file is recorded. Let's get started. Under the cold fluorescent lights of the committee room, the screen came to life. A black interface blinked, then poured out a stream of figures. Transaction codes, dates, agency tags, grant recipients, scrolling across the display. Zohran Mamdani didn't move. He tapped the screen once and froze a section in place. Start here, he said, his voice even, almost detached. Two organizations, Zohran began, highlighting entries on the display. Different names, same address, same tax ID. Both received identical funding, $2.4 million each, through two separate agencies for a project called Urban Resilience Deployment. The screen zoomed in on the records. Pam Bondi leaned forward, holding a matching printout. We cross-checked the records, she said. Same quarter, 4 different states, 96 overlapping disbursements. Not a single one appears in GAO reports. Not one. Jaime Raskin tapped his pen against the table. What we're seeing here is just data noise, he said flatly. Unfiltered, decontextualized, and turned into political theater. It's a stunt. Zohran turned slightly in his chair. Then refute the numbers, he said. Not me. The tension in the room thickened. Byron Donalds adjusted his mic. We ran the addresses, he said, gesturing to the display. One of those entities is also listed as a contributor to a PAC that supported a major 2020 Democratic campaign. That's not a theory. That's public record. Letitia James immediately pushed back. That's guilt by metadata, she snapped. You're drawing political conclusions from file structure and address overlap. Zohran didn't turn this time. The guilt isn't in the metadata, he said. It's in the repetition. Repetition without oversight. More transactions scrolled across the screen. Payment IDs, signatures, authorizations, some handwritten, some missing entirely. A red tag blinked in the top corner. Bypass enabled. Chairwoman Pressley's voice cut through the silence. Are these live records? She asked. Zohran nodded. Confirmed, pulled from active federal systems. None of this is archived. This is all current. Bondi pointed to a new block of entries. This set includes $11 million routed to 5 shell groups, all formed within 90 days of a federal grant cycle, all with overlapping EINs. Raskin looked back at the screen, but said nothing. Pressley sat back and folded her arms, looking from the panel to the press gallery. "We will now expand the scope," she said. "I am authorizing the release of all bypass audit entries for public viewing. Full projection." The technician hesitated, then executed the command. The screen flooded with new data, names, numbers, repeat beneficiaries, states, and districts. Dozens of lines pulsed into view. For the first time during the hearing, there were no interruptions, no objections, just a heavy silence that grew with every new entry that appeared. "If this file is fabricated," Pressley finally said, her eyes locked on the screen, "we will expose it." She let the words hang. "But if it isn't, those responsible will be caught." The room was silent. The screens flickered. Each line followed the same pattern, same numbers, same time periods, slightly altered recipient names. The further the red file opened, the less it looked like chaos and more like design. Zohran Mamdani remained silent, his gaze fixed forward. But across the committee bench, the mood was shifting. Jamie Raskin leaned back, no longer interrupting. Letitia James clutched a printed notepad, but didn't look down. Raskin made the first move, his tone softer, more cautious. "Representative Mamdani," he began, "even if the numbers are correct, the larger question remains. What gives you or anyone the right to build a parallel surveillance system and incorporate it into the federal architecture?" Zohran didn't blink. "When federal systems are programmed to look the other way, independent verification becomes the last line of defense." Raskin scoffed. "You call this verification? A warrantless, unsanctioned audit run by a rogue legislator?" Zohran replied, steady and plain, "If the permitting process itself is compromised, then compliance is an illusion. This audit exists because your institutions failed to create one themselves," Zohran said, unwavering. Letitia James interrupted. "According to an internal DOJ memo dated June last year, your covert audit has not been authorized under any section of federal law related to civilian oversight or surveillance. Do you deny that?" Before Zohran could reply, Pam Bondi spoke up. "I've read that memo. It refers to a pending review, not a denial. And more importantly, the system Representative Mamdani used was authorized under Executive Order 13985, issued in 2020, and that order has never been rescinded." Zohran added, still facing the screen, "The full audit record was submitted to the Treasury Department 6 months ago. No agency responded, no objections, no suspension requests, just silence." The room fell quiet again. Anna Paulina Luna spoke next. "If this audit is supposed to be fraudulent," she said, narrowing her eyes, "why have 4 federal agencies been running diagnostics on its sandbox environment for the past year? HUD, CDC, USAID, and Education have all been pulling data from a program they claim to deny." No one answered. The silence thickened. Then, as if the tension finally broke, Jamie Raskin slammed his palm on the table. "Because they're afraid," he said, his voice echoing off the walls. "Afraid that a rogue legislator could turn a technical audit into political upheaval." Zohran didn't budge. His tone stayed level. "They're not afraid of me," he said. "They're afraid of what their own systems will reveal." And at that point, the file kept rolling, line by line, quietly filling the room with numbers nobody wanted to read aloud. What appeared next was code, raw, uncommented, buried deep inside federal accounting logic. Zohran gestured to the display. "This," he said calmly, "is where the bypass begins." The committee leaned in. The code was simple, just 17 lines, but every instruction carried weight. Zohran pointed to a string in the middle of the screen. "If transaction flag equals election year emergency, suppress audit trigger. That's not a glitch, that's intent." Pam Bondi narrowed her eyes. "You're saying this segment disables the system's ability to alert regulators?" Zohran nodded. not just disables, it masks. It actively prevents reconciliation with GAO oversight. And here, he tapped another line, is where it resets tracking IDs. It makes sure duplicated entries don't raise red flags. That's how money gets spent twice without ever showing up twice on paper. Bondi turned toward the panel. We verified the code against Treasury's public schema. This language doesn't exist in the official version, but it does appear in the live system. That means someone inserted it outside the normal revision schedule. Raskin tried to downplay the finding. Every system has redundancies. Not every redundancy is a conspiracy. Zohran responded instantly. And not every redundancy is timed perfectly to elections, hidden behind undocumented variables, and funneled to shell organizations with mirrored funds. Letitia James, visibly frustrated, interrupted. So what you're telling us is that a few lines of back-end code justify this entire hearing? That this invisible script is your smoking gun? Zohran didn't even turn to look at her. That line of code hid $47 million in replicated transactions. It wasn't inactive. It was invisible. Byron Donalds leaned in. We traced the same suppression logic in both HUD and CDC audit trails, Byron Donalds continued. 3 versions of the same script, identical syntax, different file names. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens when someone designs a system to look clean while it launders data in the background. The screen shifted again. A block of code appeared, complete with internal timestamps. Last edited June 28, 2020, Zohran pointed out, highlighting the header. This was changed just months before the election. The user tag is linked to a contractor assigned to the Office of Budget Coordination. No review, no flags. And yet the same suppression flag appears across multiple departments. The room remained frozen as the final line of code blinked on the screen, a single instruction surrounded by silence. Zohran stepped back from the controls, letting the projection speak for itself. That script didn't just reroute funding. It told the system to forget those funds ever existed. At that moment, Byron Donalds stood. We overlaid the bypass pattern over the past 3 election cycles, 2018, 2020, and 22. The match rate is over 87%. These code insertions didn't happen randomly. They happened right before ballots were printed. He tapped his tablet, and a series of graphs appeared. Vertical bars showing funding spikes aligned perfectly with campaign weeks. Bondi added quietly, 12 organizations received multi-year grants within 60 days of election dates, most with no renewal history. Every time, they changed legal names but kept the same staff, same office, same bank accounts. Jamie Raskin leaned in, trying to reassert control. Correlation does not mean criminality. Patterns are easy to find when you're searching in reverse. Zohran didn't move. Then prove the pattern won't appear again, he said. Because it will. Same structure, new names. That's how it survives. Letitia James broke the stalemate. She didn't argue the numbers. This time she shifted tactics. None of this has been evaluated by the DOJ. We are discussing unauthorized interpretations of raw code and fiscal metadata. That requires a legal framework, not conjecture. Zohran's voice remained steady. This was submitted to DOJ, Treasury, and OMB. No reply, no dispute. 6 months of silence doesn't mean oversight. It means complicity. Ana Paulina Luna adjusted her microphone. 4 agencies, 12 flagged noses, identical scripts, and we're still calling this interpretation? With respect, Chair Pressley, if this had been uncovered under any Republican administration, subpoenas would have been on the table already. The chamber's tension thickened. Letitia spoke again, this time directly to Chairwoman Pressley. Madam Chair, I formally request this hearing be suspended until proper legal review is conducted. The data being presented may constitute a breach of protocol under existing oversight statutes. Pressley didn't blink. The only protocol breached here is the one designed to keep this code hidden. She turned to the committee clerk and gave a single order. The Oversight Committee now issues immediate subpoenas for the financial backends of all 12 NOSs listed in Appendix B of the Red File. Full forensic access, effective now. The silence had barely faded when a sound came from the side aisle. A junior staffer, badge trembling on his lanyard, stepped forward and handed a small, unmarked device to Chairwoman Pressley. She took it without a word and nodded to the technician. Within seconds, the device was connected to the secure terminal. A single video file appeared on the screen. No title, no metadata, just a timestamp. September 12th, 2023. Pam Bondi glanced at the feed and asked the only question that mattered. Verified? The technician nodded. Checksum confirmed. Source encryption matches House server standards. The room tensed. Chairwoman Pressley nodded once. Broadcast. The screen flickered, then settled. The image was grainy but clear. An internal planning room, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, audio picked up by a fixed microphone. Around the table sat 3 senior Democratic strategists, their faces unmistakable. One voice spoke first. If this audit is legally binding, we'll lose discretionary control for the next 10 years. Another replied quieter, more cautious. Postpone the hearing, challenge the chain of custody. Stop the story before it airs. The final voice silenced the others, recognizably Letitia James. We don't reject it, we reshape it. If we lose language, we lose control. The recording stopped. The room was silent. Bondi stood, her posture sharpened by the gravity of what had just been shown. Madam Chair, I request voice print authentication. The technician complied. 30 seconds later, he looked up. Confirmed, all 3 speakers match congressional audio records. No signs of digital manipulation. The file was recorded inside the Longworth building. Across the aisle, Raskin's face had lost all color. He tried to speak, but nobody gave him the space. Letitia James stared at the screen, jaw clenched, silent. Byron Donalds leaned forward, his voice cold. The question isn't whether the file was planted. The question is how long this strategy has been in place. Zohran didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The screen said it all. Chairwoman Pressley lowered the volume, then looked directly at Letitia James. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Attorney General James, do you deny that you were on that tape? Letitia James said nothing. Not a word. Only the faint tapping of her pen answered. And that silence, in a room meant for answers, was louder than any confession. Outside the hearing room, the American media erupted. Hashtags like #RedFileNow and #AuditThePacks shot to the top of every platform. The video clip, Letitia James in her own voice, strategizing how to delay and control the narrative, played on primetime cable. On Fox News, a red banner read, "Unfiltered, undeniable, unforgivable." CNN didn't air the clip live, but began to shift its language. Alleged recordings raised questions about the integrity of the process. Inside the hearing room, no one had to say it. Everyone knew public pressure was surging through the walls. Ayanna Pressley adjusted her microphone, her tone now more assertive and commanding. The committee recognizes that the public interest has changed. This is no longer a closed-door review. This is now a matter of national accountability. She nodded to Zohran. Representative Mamdani, please continue. Zohran tapped the terminal, opening the next section of the red file. This segment cross-references the recipients of the marked disbursements with funding for media-affiliated PACs and regional television stations. The screen displayed 4 organizations. All received direct or adjacent transfers from the same funding pipeline. All funded local media outlets operating in swing districts. He pointed to an overlapping chart. This isn't coverage, this is financial saturation. Pam Bondi leaned forward. Federal money should not flow to media through disguised pipelines. Alex Padua cut in, his tone clearer than before. These organizations represent underserved voices. What you're dismantling isn't fraud, it's equity. Zohran said nothing for a moment. Then, if fairness requires money laundering, it isn't fairness, it's camouflage. The words were sharp, unyielding. Jamie Raskin, visibly unsettled, tried to regain control. Representative Mamdani has not demonstrated criminal intent. There is no indictment, no formal complaint, no legal recognition that this audit has merit. Byron Donalds countered without hesitation. This isn't a court, Mr. Raskin. It's worse, it's a mirror. No one answered for a long moment. Bondi turned to Chairwoman Pressley. Madam Chair, we request an urgent summons for the financial leaders of the 4 media-affiliated organizations listed in Item 7 of the filing. Pressley glanced at the screen. The motion passed without objection. Within minutes, a signed order was issued. Full disclosure, 5 days to comply, direct mail to the Office of Congressional Legal Counsel. Letitia James hadn't spoken since the recording aired. Padilla quietly folded his papers. Raskin stared at his notes but stopped reading. Outside the Capitol, the crowd had doubled in size. The mood was different now, no longer just questions, but demands for consequences. Inside, the shift was unmistakable. One by one, Democratic members slipped from their seats. The mood hardened. What had begun as spectacle was turning into fallout. Jamie Raskin no longer interrupted. He didn't redirect. He sat back, hands folded, voice subdued. Mistakes may have been made, he said, not meeting anyone's eyes. But system-wide corruption, that's a dangerous claim. The structure of our institutions matters. So does public trust. We shouldn't erode it with overreach. Zohran didn't miss a beat. What erodes trust is discovering that the architecture of your democracy has been retrofitted for invisibility. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The red file didn't create doubt. It revealed what's been bought with silence. Then came the final exhibit, a printed audit, unredacted, third-party certified by a former Treasury compliance officer. It cross-verified 93% of the transactions in the red file. Line by line, it had been submitted to Congress 2 months earlier. No response, no follow-up, not even acknowledgement of receipt. Pam Bondi placed the document before the committee. "This was sitting in your inbox," she said quietly, to no one in particular, while taxpayer dollars were rerouted through front groups with no oversight. Letitia James did not reply. She hadn't spoken since her voice had surfaced in the leaked footage. Her hands remained still, eyes fixed on the desk. Alex Padilla had gone silent. His nameplate was still on the table, but his chair was empty. Zohran offered no celebration, no claim of victory. He simply looked at the wall of monitors, now filled with final tallies, and said flatly, "I didn't come here for applause. I came here for records, and now they're no longer buried." Bondi stood. This hearing has revealed not just abuse, but orchestration. Not just silence, but infrastructure built around avoidance. Chairwoman Pressley raised her gavel for the final time that afternoon. The Oversight Committee formally refers all named entities in connected networks to the Department of Justice for full investigation and prosecution review. The session stands adjourned. Chairwoman Pressley's gavel fell. No one clapped. No one moved. Zohran Mamdani rose from his seat alone. There was no press conference, no handshake line. He exited through a side corridor, his footsteps the only sound echoing beneath the rotunda. Outside, the crowd had shifted from noise to stillness. Protesters no longer shouted slogans. They watched in absolute silence as he walked past the Capitol steps and descended into a sea of handmade signs. One read, "Thank you for showing us." Another, "We were never supposed to know." Inside, Chairwoman Pressley remained at the bench, quietly reviewing the final transcript. Pam Bondi, still holding the unredacted audit, handed it to a federal courier. Byron Donalds reviewed the subpoena compliance schedule. No one celebrated, no one needed to. On cable news, anchors struggled to explain what had happened. Fox called it the day the files spoke. MSNBC asked if oversight had turned into overreach. But everyone watching understood. This was never about Zohran Mamdani. It was about what had been engineered in silence, then exposed without a single leak from inside government. At 6:12 p.m., a single post appeared on Zohran's official X account. No image, no thread, just text. "You buried the audit. We resurrected the record." On the House Oversight live stream archive, the final 30 seconds were clipped and posted by millions. Pam Bondi closing the red file, Pressley handing it to the DOJ liaison, and behind them a wall of monitors going dark. One by one, a message appeared at the bottom of the feed. Red file system breach confirmed. Phase 2 queued. The message lingered for exactly 4 seconds, just long enough for the country to realize this was not closure. The red file did not accuse. It revealed. It did not prosecute. it exposed. For more than a decade, public funds had flowed beneath the surface of oversight, shielded by code, by silence, and by political convenience. What Zohran Mamdani uncovered was not mere misuse. It was design, intentional, repeatable, protected by bureaucratic darkness and reinforced by media distraction. And now the darkness had been lit, not with speeches, not with outrage, but with evidence. And evidence, once made public, does not go back to sleep.